One of the most common questions we see from new photographers is, what should my first camera be? And while we do have an answer for this question, we just think you might be surprised at what we say.
Rather than just telling you the name of a camera that will probably be outdated in a year or two the next time you watch this video, what we're actually going to do is teach you how to think when it comes to buying camera bodies so that you can make the right decision no matter what your budget is or where you are in your photography business.
Yeah. But before we jump into that, we want to introduce ourselves.
I'm Hunter.
And I'm Sarah.
And we're Hunter and Sarah Photography, a husband and wife professional wedding photography team.
We are also educators, and our goal is to help photographers to build strong foundations in both their businesses and their personal lives so that they can run profitable and sustainable photography businesses.
So if you've been watching our videos lately, then you know that we're in the middle of a series called 10 Free Marketing Tactics for Photographers. And this series is really all about how newer photographers can use their time and their energy, rather than spending money, to start booking paid jobs, especially when they're early in their business.
Yeah, but this week we are pausing that series to address what we believe is the best way to figure out which camera is going to be right for you and your business. And we're also going to dispel what we believe is one of the biggest myths when it comes to camera gear.
Okay, so here's that myth. The myth is that one of the three big camera manufacturers, so Sony, Canon, and Nikon, is clearly better than the other. Honestly, we have found that that's just not true. Now, at any given point in time, one of them probably has the edge over the other two.
Yeah. But then, naturally, the others respond by releasing a new camera a few months or maybe a year later, and then they have the newest and the best. And then that cycle repeats in this just never-ending race where camera technology just keeps getting better, which is great.
Yeah, it's great for us. And probably the most extreme example of this, and maybe the first one that comes to mind for a lot of people, is the fact that Sony in 2014, really from 2014 to 2018, was the only of the big three who was producing professional mirrorless cameras. And so during those years, they really did have a major edge over Sony. Sony had a major edge over Nikon and Canon. But a few years later, Nikon and Canon figured it out. They're all caught up. And now all three of these camera manufacturers have a whole lineup of mirrorless cameras, both entry-level and professional. And the advantage has really sort of evened out.
Yeah. And here's the important thing to consider. For most photographers, the first camera that you buy is likely going to be the brand that you use for the rest of your career. This isn't like going and buying like a Ford truck and then a couple years later being like, I'm done with that, and switching to a Subaru. It's not that easy.
And here's why. Once you start buying lenses for whatever camera body you have, you've basically started to commit to that brand. And in order to switch, for example, from Canon to Nikon, not only would you have to sell your Canon camera and buy a Nikon camera, but every single Canon lens you own, you would have to sell and then rebuy in Nikon. And you would almost certainly lose money on any sort of selling and buying interaction like that. So especially if you do this more, other than like your first year when you only own one camera and one lens, it's pretty hard to do that, which is why, on one hand, the decision you make when you buy your first camera is actually kind of an important one.
Yes, but on the other hand, what we're going to break down in this video is that so long as you are comparing models of the same level, whether you pick a Sony or a Nikon or a Canon, you really can't go wrong. They are all fantastic manufacturers who have been making digital cameras since they were first introduced in the 90s. Or when it comes to Nikon and Canon, they've been making film cameras for like a century.
You literally can't, for all three of these manufacturers, you can find tons and tons of people who have been using them for years and swear that they are great cameras. So there's that. Now, before people start yelling at us in the comments, we do want to make it clear that most photographers will agree, by the way, that Nikon and Canon and Sony are different. But among professional photographers that we've spoken to, there really isn't a consensus that any one brand is far superior to the others or is the clear, best camera for X type of photography, so long as you're comparing cameras at the same level.
Yeah, these manufacturers certainly handle certain colors differently, and we definitely wouldn't want to be editing, a single session or a wedding day kind of in Lightroom if it was photographed with cameras from different manufacturers. But comparing any two of these companies is more like comparing like Coke versus Pepsi or like Mac versus PC. than it is like comparing like Gucci versus Walmart.
And we say Coke versus Pepsi and Mac versus PC as the examples because just like in those two cases, people are often really diehard about whatever their personal choice is when it comes to, you know, their camera manufacturer. But like we mentioned a few minutes ago, most photographers will start with, you know, Canon or Nikon, sometimes Sony. They start buying lenses, they start accumulating gear in that ecosystem. And, you know, flashes as well. It's another thing that they don't transfer across. And once you've sort of bought those lenses, then you upgrade the camera and then you buy more lenses. And it's all within that same manufacturer's ecosystem because you don't want to have to stop and sell everything and rebuy it in another company. And so over time, it sort of builds this feedback loop.
Yeah, you know, those people end up using that one brand for years, maybe even their entire career, and they become diehard fans.
Which,
you know?
by the way, that's us with Nikon. Full disclosure. I mean, we really have not professionally used a Canon or Sony camera in our entire wedding photography career.
Yeah, and you know, and rightfully so. So like that camera brand's like for us, it's Nikon. Like that served them super well for years. The only problem that is in 90% of cases,
like us,
they've never seriously used a camera from the other manufacturers, even though they swear that their camera company is the best of the three brands.
Right? Or maybe this, if someone has done the switch, they probably didn't switch laterally, right? They probably switched from an entry level with one brand to a professional level in the other. Or they switch maybe from like a Canon DSLR to a Sony mirrorless, and they say Sony is way better than Canon, but really what they're probably experiencing is that mirrorless is better than DSLR, and we'll get to that in a minute. The fact that they, you know, upgraded to a camera 3 times as nice sometimes is forgotten in sort of the switch.
Yeah. But let's pause here for a second so that we can be super, super duper clear about what we are not saying. We are not saying that all cameras are the same or that any Nikon camera is as good as any Sony camera. That's, of course, not true.
And you know that, of course, already because you have seen on their websites that, you know, Nikon and Sony and Canon all sell cameras for under $1,000 and for Canon and Nikon, $500 or less. And then they also sell cameras that are $6,500, right? There is absolutely a difference in quality as you move up the product line for any of these manufacturers. But if you're comparing Nikon, Canon, or Sony at the same point in the product line, the differences aren't going to be that huge.
Yeah, of course. This means that you need to know where in the product line you are. So that's what we're going to spend a lot of this video on. When it comes to professional cameras, there are really like 2 big factors to consider nowadays. There's crop sensor versus a full frame, and DSLR versus mirrorless. Both of these revolve kind of around the image sensor, the small piece of technology in your camera that actually like sees the light and then records what a scene looked like.
So in crop sensor cameras, this sensor is smaller and more inexpensive when compared to full frame cameras, which is why, at least in the portrait and wedding world, crop sensor cameras are typically considered beginner cameras and full frame cameras are considered the more professional options. Now, if you want to know more about crop sensor versus full frame, we have an entire video on just that subject, which I believe the link is here.
Yeah. This is your first decision to make, and really, it's a decision about cost. Can you afford to spend more to get a larger sensor? You know, if your budget is under $1,000, your only option is probably an entry-level crop sensor camera. But if you have over $1,000 to spend, and especially when you're in like the $1,500 budget range, you should probably consider a full frame camera.
So if you clicked on this video because you have like $500 or $700 to spend on a camera and are trying to figure out what your first is going to be, at this point, your first takeaway should probably be that you are looking for a crop sensor DSLR camera or maybe a crop sensor mirrorless if you're on the higher end of that range. By the way, Nikon calls crop sensor cameras DX versus FX is their full frame, and then Sony and Canon call them ASPC. So if you see ASPC or DX, depending on which website you're on, that means you're looking at a crop sensor camera, which is going to be a little bit less expensive.
The second decision to make is DSLR versus mirrorless. Now, DSLR or digital single lens reflex cameras.
You don't need to know what that acronym means.
Yeah,
Just let it fall right out of your head.
Bonus. These cameras have been around since digital photography went like mainstream in the late 90s and early thousands, and up until about like 8 years ago, these were really all that existed for professional photographers.
And then, like I mentioned before, around 2014, mirrorless cameras started showing up from Sony, and then a few years later from Canon and Nikon as well. And essentially, mirrorless cameras they're smaller, they're lighter, and frankly, they have better technology. But they're also newer and feel a little bit more techy. So if you've been shooting for a really long time with DSLRs and you're used to looking through your viewfinder and seeing the actual scene, you're actually looking through your lens through a series of mirrors, it might feel a little weird to pick up a mirrorless camera and you're actually looking at a digital screen that's projecting what your lens is seeing, right? That might be a little bit different for you. Ooh, bless you. Bless you. It might be a little bit different if you are used to using DSLRs.
Yep. When they were like first picking up steam in the mid to late 2010s, mirrorless cameras were way more expensive than the DSLR cameras. Now, as like the prices have come down and these manufacturers have introduced that like entry level mirrorless camera, they're priced kind of about the same as the entry level DSLRs, kind of on average. Which mirrorless lenses, while mirrorless lenses are still more expensive than their DSLR counterparts, DSLR versus mirrorless is honestly much more about preference than it is about cost, kind of like it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, when we first got a mirrorless camera, when Nikon first released the Z6, it was like, I think $2,200, and that was the only option if you wanted to go mirrorless. Now, as you'll see later in this video, you can get started in the mirrorless ecosystem for like $1,000. By the way, if you want more info on DSLR versus mirrorless, we also have a full video. It's our very first video we produced for this channel. Also, link is right up here. The spoiler alert, though, is that honestly, we think mirrorless is just better, and if you can at all afford, you should probably just start with mirrorless.
Yeah. Now, if all of that sounds confusing, hopefully this next chart will help you kind of get a sense of this. Since DSLR cameras and their lenses are cheaper than mirrorless camera and mirrorless lenses, and since crop sensors are cheaper than full frame, it makes sense that crop sensor DSLRs are the cheapest. And if you want a crop sensor mirrorless or a full frame DSLR, those are going to be a bit more expensive. And of course, full frame mirrorless cameras are going to be the most expensive of all.
Okay, so all of this information is great, but if you've noticed, we still haven't really told you which cameras are the best, and we're getting to that. But if you're going to be comparing cameras, and especially if you aren't sold on Nikon versus Canon versus Sony just yet, then knowing how to compare apples to apples as opposed to comparing, apples to bicycles is really important.
Yeah. So while we were kind of preparing for this video, we did a lot of research.
Maybe too much. Confession, we got lost down the rabbit hole a little bit, and we ended up looking at the individual web pages on all of the websites for all of the cameras that these three manufacturers are currently selling. Something like 45 cameras. We looked through all the specs, we did a lot of comparing, we gathered some data, and what we found sort of confirmed the suspicion that I had had for several years now, which is that kind of it's all the same. Like, really, these three manufacturers have almost the same lineup of DSLR and mirrorless cameras, just their own version of it.
Yeah, like to the point that when you're looking at pricing and specs, like it's uncanny. With very few exceptions here and there, Nikon and Canon are selling like the same number of DSLR camera bodies on their website, and even the same number of like crop versus full frame sensors, 4 each. It almost felt like every single camera had like a cousin at the other company.
So, for example, if your budget's around $500, you're probably looking at a crop sensor DSLR. And the Nikon D3400 and the Canon Rebel T7 are pretty much your two options at the under $500 price point, and they are incredibly comparable. Now, if you have maybe $2,000, but you don't want to go mirrorless for whatever reason, which, there's a whole video about that, like I said, you're looking at a full-frame DSLR, $2,000, you're probably looking at a Nikon D750, which is very comparable to a Canon 5D Mark IV, etc. Now, again, in the consideration, just for the sake of simplicity, we excluded older versions of current cameras, right? So we did not look at the Canon 5D Mark III, we just assumed the 4 is the updated version with all of the manufacturers.
Now, if you are really, really interested, here's a breakdown of what we found. We are not going to keep this up super long since we don't want this to turn into like a super data heavy video. So pause the video here if you are interested. If there is a takeaway to be had from this chart, it's that, you know, on the DSLR side, Canon's cameras tend to be a bit cheaper than Nikon's, although not always. Also, keep in mind that these charts are current as of September 2022. So if you are watching this video like super far in the future, this chart might not be as helpful.
Although we imagine probably the same principles will apply to the lineups, you know, moving forward. By the way, we didn't just research DSLRs, as you probably imagined, right? So this is the mirrorless version of that chart. And of course, now we included Sony since they are primarily in the mirrorless space. Now, we looked into the cameras with these three manufacturers. And again, once you excluded sort of older versions for the most part, we had a couple of small exceptions, but basically we found 2 crop sensor and 5 full frame cameras from Nikon and Canon and Sony. This time it was actually Nikon that came out cheaper. Sony was the most expensive and Canon was sort of right in the middle. So again, pause this video if you really want to sort of dive in and look at the comparison more thoroughly, but we're going to keep moving on.
Now, if you don't quite have the time to go through these camera manufacturers' websites and compare all, 40 models like we did, the biggest things to pay attention to when comparing cameras, other than like crop versus full frame and DSLR versus mirrorless, which you've kind of hopefully figured out which one you prefer by now, are the actual size of the image sensor and maximum ISO.
So these are the other 2 things that you would be sort of comparing as you're looking at models across different brands or even among the same brand. So the first, like we mentioned, is image size. Now, this is measured in megapixels and basically tells you how large the digital file is going to be that your camera is going to capture, right? So how many actual pixels are in the image? How big is it? How big can you print it? That sort of thing. Now, the higher the megapixel number, the larger the file will be. Again, probably the most important thing to know is that right now in the camera industry, 25 megapixels is pretty much the average. There are a few cameras, as you saw on those charts, that go beyond 35. Those are the sort of super high megapixel count. And then anything less than 20 is sort of becoming outdated. But for reference, again, because 25 megapixels probably doesn't mean anything to you, that's about 4,000 pixels by 6,000 pixels, which is roughly twice the resolution of a 4K TV. So unless your clients are regularly printing your images larger than 16 by 24, which is like the size of my torso basically, unless your clients are regularly printing large format prints, 25 megapixels is plenty.
So basically, unless you are like a fashion photographer.
Yeah, unless you're doing shoots that are ending up on billboards or your clients are doing massive wall art. And even then, especially for things like canvases, it would still work. But anyway, the second thing besides the image sensor is the maximum ISO.
Yeah, so maximum ISO is a good indication of how your camera is going to handle low light situations. So some low end cameras have like a maximum ISO of 10 or 12,000. While most high-end professional cameras have a maximum ISO of more than 100,000.
We also found one camera from Canon that had a maximum ISO of 800,000, which is just crazy. Here's the thing. It's not really so much about the max itself, right? I can't tell you we've ever taken a photo at, ISO 102,000, which is the max on several of our cameras. But if you took an entry-level camera whose max was about 12,000 and then a high-end camera whose max was 100,000 and you shot the same very dark scene at ISO 10,000, the nicer camera with the higher maximum ISO would produce a much less grainy image. Because the thing is, the closer you get to a camera's max, the grainier it's going to get. So if you're shooting at ISO 10,000, which is high but not unheard of, and your max ISO is 12,000, oh my gosh, it's going to be so grainy. But if your max ISO is 100,000 and you're at 10,000, you're still several stops below the max, and it's not going to be too bad. It won't be as bad as the entry level at least. And that's why Sarah mentioned the maximum ISO is going to tell you sort of a proxy for how well your camera is going to handle all low light scenarios and not just when shooting right at your max.
Yeah. Now, for the sake of simplicity, throughout this entire video so far, we've been using pricing for new cameras, like directly from the manufacturer's website, wherever, it was available. But, obviously, if you are looking at used cameras, the math sort of begins to change here.
And we totally agree that buying used cameras can be a great way to save money and get started. But there is I guess, a word of caution to be had here.
If you're trying to buy a used camera in order to save money, we would recommend buying the used version of one of the cameras that is currently being sold on Nikon, Canon, or Sony's website. If the camera isn't listed on one of those sites right now, it's likely because it's been retired by the manufacturer, which is basically just saying it's old and outdated.
So, for example, I mentioned earlier that Nikon D3400 is a great entry-level camera from Nikon right now, under $500. But if you could find a D3400 used for, say, $400, then it's like, okay, great. Like, maybe I'll save $100. Yes, I'm getting a used camera. There are some factors to consider with that, but great. I'm getting a used camera and I'm saving $100. Now, if you found a Nikon D3000, so 4 editions older than the D3400, and it was only $200 instead of, $500 for a brand new 3400, I still probably wouldn't buy that, because once you start looking into it, the camera's sensor is half the size. It's 12 megapixels, which, by current standards is tiny. And it's old, it has outdated technology, it doesn't have live view. There's all these things to consider. Once you start moving into retired cameras, honestly, a lot of the technology is probably going to be obsolete, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, just digital technology or digital camera technology improves so very quickly that even if a camera is just a few years old,
and the D3000 is more than 12 years old at this point, just for reference,
it can be just completely and hopelessly outdated compared to the newer cameras. So while saving money on used gear can be like super sweet and awesome, you don't want to accidentally spend your money in like all of your hard-earned cash on a dinosaur thinking that you're getting a great deal.
Okay, so that has been a lot of information. So we're going to sort of sum things up with really what is the core of our advice, which is the best beginner camera is really just whatever you can afford right now. If you have $500 to spend, like we mentioned, you're probably looking at a Nikon D3400 or a Canon Rebel T7. And honestly, which of those two you get is not that important.
Yeah, and if you have like $1,500 to spend on just a camera body, you're probably going to look at like a Nikon Z6, a Canon EOS R, or like a Sony A7C. And again, it really doesn't matter all that much which one you go with. Just pick up a camera, get started shooting, and learn as you go. But,
guys,
well, that's it.
Guys, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. Our hope really is that this has sort of demystified some of the debate out there about Canon versus Nikon versus Sony, and show you that you really can't go wrong as long as you are getting a nice camera from one of those manufacturers.
Yeah, and if you haven't already, we would really encourage you to join our Facebook community, Mastering the Wedding Photography Biz with Hunter and Sarah. In that group, we are building a free community of other photographers who are also building their photography businesses and helping each other out along the way.
So next week, we are diving back into our free marketing tactics series. So be sure to like and subscribe so that you do not miss when that video drops.
Yeah, and if you found this video helpful, if you have any questions, if you'd like to add anything that you feel like we missed, feel free to comment below.
But that's it, guys. We'll see you next week.